Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last event here at the U.S. Center today, Harnessing Innovative Finance for Nature-Based Solutions, Debt Conversions for Nature and Climate. And before we get to our wonderful panel, I'd like to introduce a video from the Nature Conservancy.
They used to be once-in-a-century events, but as climate change worsens, we're seeing them every year. Stronger storms, floods, wildfires, and endless droughts. These events can cause lasting harm. Homes damaged in floods may take years to rebuild. Farmers who lose crop after crop have to find another way of life. Their communities have to find another source of food. How do we deal with the climate-fueled disasters here now? It's not hopeless. We can do more than just react to disasters when they happen. We can protect and strengthen our communities. So what are the solutions? Look around. Nature has been perfecting many of them for millions of years. The roots of healthy forests act as underground shields against landslides, storing water that would erode slopes and threaten lives. Just 1 acre of wetlands can hold 1 million gallons of water, acting like a giant sponge to prevent floods. And on coasts, a healthy coral reef can absorb 97% of a wave's force before it hits shore, making us safer when storms hit. Climate change doesn't affect us all the same way, though. Many of the people hit hardest have the fewest resources to adapt. That's why we have to work together to develop solutions that make our communities more resilient. Whether that's helping farmers prepare for more unpredictable seasons, or protecting coral reefs so they continue to guard our coasts. And when we partner with nature, our lives improve in even more ways. Restoring habitat returns important nutrients to our soils, creates nurseries for fish to grow, and cleans our air and water. And nature isn't just helping us adapt to climate change now. It also keeps carbon out of the atmosphere, helping limit future warming. That's crucial, because when it comes to protecting our communities from climate change, every degree counts. And so does every action, for today and for tomorrow.
And now I'd like to introduce, as the moderator of our upcoming discussion, Sonia Gibbs, the Managing Director and Head of Sustainable Finance at the Institute of International Finance.
Wow, awesome turnout for 4:30 in the afternoon. Well done. This is going to be a great discussion. Very nice to see everybody. I wanted just to say a few words to kick off. I mean, everybody in this room is going to be really clear on the problems we're trying to address in the challenging debt/climate/nature space. Clearly, as you all know, at COP, the world is facing a climate and biodiversity crisis of unprecedented magnitude, and at exactly the same time, record high debt levels and increasing debt burdens that limit the ability of countries to manage these challenges. If you have to pay more and more for debt service and interest rates are rising, you have very little left to devote to biodiversity and nature. I just wanted to illustrate the magnitude of the debt problem here. The global debt stock has risen to a record high of over $300 trillion in the first half of this year, 100 trillion more than it was a decade ago. So you've had years of low interest rates, a lot of debt binging, as it were. And I'd particularly highlight the risks for emerging and developing economies where debt is at record levels. They've got aging populations, rising healthcare costs, and also a very huge need for climate finance. So it's going to drive government debt higher, even as countries are pursuing net zero goals. So how do we square this circle? We're going to need an estimated $9 trillion annually to reach net zero by 2050, much of that for emerging markets. So here at COP, you're seeing all kinds of evidence of climate vulnerable countries, small island states, countries that are restructuring. So where are the solutions? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. Blended finance can help address the climate debt nexus. But just to put it into perspective, over the past 5 years, remember I said 9 trillion, blended finance flows have averaged around 10 billion a year. I mean, it's an entirely different order of magnitude. And only a tiny fraction of that, 12 million, is going to low-income countries that most need it. You cannot have sustainable growth without sustainable debt. So this area of debt conversions, debt for climate, debt for nature swaps is really growing in importance. In fact, I think debt for nature swaps are one of the hottest tickets in conservation finance. Earlier this year, Ecuador had the biggest deal of this kind, refinancing $1.6 billion of its commercial debt at a discount in exchange for a revenue stream in conservation around the Galapagos Islands. And we're going to hear more about Gabon's $500 million debt for nature swap in August from our panelists, along with work on the broader debt climate nature solution set that both TNC and DFC have led in recent years. So I'm very pleased to introduce our two very distinguished panelists today. Scott Nathan, who was appointed by President Biden as CEO of the U.S. International Development Finance Corporation, the DFC, in 2022. Scott's also held senior roles at the U.S. State Department and other government agencies. And Jen Morris, who is CEO of the Nature Conservancy, as you all know, is a global conservation organization that partners with communities around the world to overcome barriers to climate and biodiversity solutions, and increasingly climate and biodiversity finance. So please, welcome to the stage. Let's get started. Okay, let's back this up a little bit. Is the mic on? Yeah, great, excellent. Why is this area a priority for both of your organizations, and what's been accomplished to date?
Who do you want to start?
You.
Okay. Thanks so much. It's wonderful to be here. So this whole area is critical for a lot of the reasons how you addressed it. So we really have these triple crises: the biodiversity, climate, and debt crises. And in many of the places where the Nature Conservancy works, we're seeing this play out every day, where countries simply cannot afford to build resilient communities, resilient farms, resilient coasts, because they're having to pay a lot of their GDP on an annual basis back to their creditors. And so how do we address this? And first, I just want to say, Scott, the leadership that the DFC has provided in this space is unbelievable. I tell everyone we need every single government in the world to have a DFC. So I just want to recognize the leadership of the United States in this whole facility, because the real end game for this is how do we bridge the gap, the $700 billion a year gap in financing for conservation that we know is needed for developing countries in the global south. We can't do it with philanthropy alone. So this mechanism is absolutely essential to really help us attain what for so long in conservation finance has been the unattainable. And that is getting private sector money, real private sector money at scale into the nature conservation and climate space. So we couldn't do it without the DFC.
Scott?
Well, thanks very much for that, Jen. That's fantastic. We love being your partner in these transactions. Really, you're the driving force in the transactions that we've done with you, and so it's terrific to be on stage. Thank you, Sonia, for the introduction and for the framing remarks. Look, the United States International Development Finance Corporation is focused on bringing solutions to the world's greatest challenges, doing that by mobilizing private capital. In this issue, it all comes together. First and foremost, we're a development finance institution that is focused on the private sector. We're not looking to increase debt by doing projects of any type, climate or otherwise, with countries. We're doing it at the private level, not at the sovereign level. Secondly, we're focused on development challenges, and there's obviously no greater development challenge facing the world at the moment than addressing the climate crisis. That's a huge priority for President Biden and across the whole U.S. government. In the last year, we did $3.7 billion of climate finance. That's up from just $500 million 2 years ago. It's a priority across many of our different sectors. We did 56 deals in climate finance during 2023. And it uses all of our tools: lending, loan guarantees, equity investment, technical assistance. But today we're talking about the political risk insurance tool we have and the role that that can play in these debt exchange deals. We were involved with TNC in Belize. We were provider of political risk insurance in the Galapagos transaction in Ecuador you mentioned. We were involved with TNC in Gabon, and we're looking for more. We're just beginning to make a difference. But these deals are significant both in achieving our objectives of protecting countries from economic coercion by strengthening their own balance sheets and their debt management practices, and obviously also providing really important conservation benefits that have great climate outcomes as well.
And I should remind the audience, we are leaving time toward the end for your questions, so do have them ready. But let's take a step back here, and Jen, I'll start with you. Why do these ecosystems need this financial support in the first place, and what kind of impact, with the deals like this, are you hoping to achieve?
Yeah, so, as we said in the outset, and your overview was fantastic, we are facing these crises in a way that the countries, quite frankly, struggle to really build resilient communities. I'll give you a specific example in Belize. So Belize is one of the countries that we were really thrilled to partner with the DFC on. And Belize was basically almost in default. And they were post-COVID. Belize's GDP relies between 50 and 60% on tourism. COVID hit, tourism went to zero. And guess what happens? People go hungry and they go fishing. And so there's this horrible feedback loop of you take more fish from the ocean and then you destroy coral reefs and then you have less tourism because people don't want to go there because the reefs are not looking as good as they were last time they came. So it's this sort of flywheel of a downward spiral that happened during COVID for many countries the Nature Conservancy works with because they rely so much on intact natural ecosystems for their GDP. So that is why this is so important because we are able to, again, do multiple things at the same time. One, help a country reduce, not completely get out of their debt situation, of course, but significantly reduce their debt, improve their credit rating, and provide a new financing line and money that can go directly into conservation. Belize is a country where the Prime Minister Briceño is a true leader in this space. They raised their hand. They said, we want to do 30% protection of our marine ecosystems by 2030, but we simply don't have the resources to do it. Not only because Briceño happens to be a leader in the conservation space, but for that reason that the intact nature is directly connected to their economy. And so that's why this facility, again, would not at all be possible without the DFC, has been such a lifeline for countries like Belize. As Scott mentioned, we also did one most recently in Gabon, and then in partnering with the Inter-American Development Bank, we've done another one in the country of Barbados. And of course, you all know that Mia Motley has been a leader in this space to push governments to change the way they're doing international financing. So we were able to do a transaction there. In total, from the first deal we did in 2016 in the Seychelles, which now has protected a marine ecosystem the size of Germany, we've refinanced $1.2 billion in debt across those four countries, unlocking $400 million in money for conservation. And that has helped preserve a marine ecosystem the size of the Gulf of Mexico. This is truly transformative finance, and it's all coming from the private sector. I just want to reiterate that again. We talk constantly about how there's not enough philanthropy, there's not enough public money, and this partnership that we have working with banks like Credit Suisse and Bank of America, we are able to actually unlock this money from the private sector. So that is why this is so transformational, and we're thrilled with Pew's transaction in partnership with the DFC and the Inter-American Development Bank. And now we want all the NGOs that work in this space to get involved. It can't just be TNC, it can't just be Pew. So we encourage any of you that are from an NGO or other type of institution that plays in this space, please come and talk to us because we would love to share this and make sure that it replicates even further.
So maybe I just add quickly, Jen referred to it, the transaction in the Galapagos, which was not with the TNC, but with other partners, and we're interested in broadening out the number of participants in these transactions and partners as much as possible. The transaction in the Galapagos was really interesting because during the time in which we were working with Ecuador and our partners were working with Ecuador, their bonds traded down considerably for a variety of reasons, post-COVID, economic hangover, some political issues in Ecuador, and also a rising interest rate environment. But what that allowed us to do when the transaction closed was issue a new loan to buy back in a tender old bonds, and as you mentioned, retire $1.6 billion face amount of debt. We provided $656 million of political risk insurance for that. But that transaction, because of the huge savings it produced, also funded a trust fund of $450 million over the life, the 18 and a half years of the transaction, that will enforce against illegal fishing. And that's not just from people who become poor, but that's also from nations that don't follow the international rules. It will help provide for people who are economically dislocated in the ending of fishing in the expanded marine conservation area around the Galapagos. And the Galapagos is obviously an incredibly important asset for Ecuador from a tourism point of view, but it's also an incredibly important asset of the whole world and everybody's sort of biodiversity and heritage that comes from that incredible place, the Galapagos. So that transaction was a win on so many levels, like the others that Jen mentioned. Let me just say one quick word about political risk insurance, because political risk insurance is a tool the United States has been using for 75 years, going back to 1948, and the Marshall Plan, the Economic Recovery Act of 1948, created it. Our predecessor agency started issuing political risk insurance policies in the 70s. Over the life of the United States' involvement in using this tool, it's been more than $50 billion of political risk insurance. It's very important for mobilizing private capital in situations of high risk. But if you think about the Marshall Plan helped Europe recover from the devastation of World War II. I can't think of any greater potential devastation than the climate crisis and the necessity of not just getting ready for rebuilding from that, but helping to mitigate and prevent it. And so to use that tool that has the heritage in the Marshall Plan to help facilitate these kind of transactions, I think is a very nice kind of historical circle.
I wonder, you both have worked in this space for many years, and I'm thinking about, private sector appetite for something like debt for nature or debt for climate swaps. Traditionally, it's kind of been seen as maybe a niche area, maybe more for public sector. But you're clearly seeing some change in appetite, yeah? Is that, Jen?
Yeah, absolutely. The first transaction that we did, I'll quote a banker who said, "This was the most complex thing we've ever done, and we can't wait to do it again." For a bunch of reasons. One, bankers want to see impact, and they love to see something like as exciting as a debt for nature swap. I mean, many bankers don't get to work on something as cool as that. And of course, it also is great for employees, for management in these banks, that their employees are saying, "Hey, when can we do this?" So we're seeing huge appetite. Lots and lots of banks coming to us saying, "Can we do this? We heard that you guys did this with Bank of America. Can we do this now? We'd really like to get into this space." So, and we're also seeing, of course, from the buyers, from the bondholders themselves, lots and lots of appetite. And that's obviously critical to continue the demand, because investors are looking for low risk, fixed income products that have impact. And that's exactly what this is.
Yeah, and the scale of the transactions, these are capital markets transactions that require either the issuance of new bonds or a new loan in countries that are of higher risk and by definition have a high level of indebtedness, or else we wouldn't be contemplating this transaction. That's really where our political risk insurance comes in order to access the deep pool of institutional investors who are interested in these kind of bonds without the addition of the insurance that we're providing. I don't think the pool of institutional investors would be even remotely deep enough in order to fund these transactions.
So quite a lot of change, but maybe talk a little bit about why these transactions have been challenging historically, financing nature. And, as this work goes forward, why can't we just sort of wave a wand and scale it up, Well,
the first thing that's the real issue at the heart of these transactions is not the capital markets side. It's getting the government, where we're talking about working, to see the value in the transaction and agree to the conservation commitments that they're making. These in some ways are giant impact bond transactions. And the only way that works is if the government, if the authorities in place agree to make the commitments that are at the heart of that impact delivery. That can take a long time. There's complicated politics. There's a lot of things to explain, a lot of negotiation underway to make sure that can be enforced. That's where TNC comes in.
Agree with that. I think the government commitment is critical. And also, quite frankly, the creativity of institutions like DFC. We don't have a lot of other governments that are doing this yet. And that's why we want all of you in this room to go out and tell this story, because we need all the multilateral development banks to be doing this type of facility. And I think that we've seen the success here, but we need to replicate it even more. I think the appetite is there from the commercial side, only if the guarantees are in place, because without that, it would never happen.
One of the conversations you hear here at COP is how you improve the investment environment in these emerging developing economies that need this type of financing, better institutions, legal regulatory frameworks, and so on. So in many ways, this type of structure, this transaction that has expectations for delivery of results, maybe it can be helpful in that context. Yeah.
Yes, is that a sign that we have to stop talking now? It's happy hour time.
Yeah.
So go ahead. You go first.
Well, I was just going to say, for all of our activity across all the different policy areas and sectors that we work in, the enabling environment to promote environment that supports foreign direct investment, that supports lending into countries, that requires good governance, that requires transparency, anti-corruption. We need to make sure that the deals we do follow local laws and conditions, but also international standards for labor, human rights, environmental compliance. So all of that is a focus of the multilateral development banks, of DFIs like DFC, of the policy environment across the U.S. government and many others, to make sure that we can help give technical assistance and also political persuasion to make sure the enabling environment supports investment.
Yeah. Maybe I just add, one of the key components of this structure is the creation of what's called a conservation trust fund. So a lot of the proceeds flow through this conservation trust fund, which is held. Government participates but doesn't actually own it or have a majority seat on the board, so that gives investors a little bit more confidence to invest in the structure. And as you just said, Scott, that's the environmental compliance is not just before the transaction closes. There's milestones set up that are closely scrutinized. You need a partner, whether it's TNC or Pew or whichever organization that has deep roots on the ground, because really the deal starts, as my friend and colleague Melissa Garvey will say, the deal starts when the deal closes. That's when the really, really hard work every single day, working with the government, working with the communities, working with the Fisher Association, with the farmers, et cetera, to actually ensure that everything goes to plan so the government can actually receive its next payment. So it's a long process of very detailed contracting that makes this all work and gives both the DFC and the investors the confidence to know that this has true ESG impact and that it will be that the financing will happen in a way that's pro-environment.
When you think about the size of the global capital pool that's dedicated to sustainable, responsible ESG types of investment, even just converting, a tiny fraction of that investment into this type of structure be hugely helpful. Let's take a little forward look and before turning to our audience for their questions, and maybe talk about where you see the biggest opportunities going forward. Scott, you want to start?
Well, I don't want to talk about individual countries because these transactions are confidential, they're difficult to negotiate, and there's also material non-public information since these are traded securities. So prior to launching them, it's difficult to talk about them. But what I would say is, unfortunately, the global debt crisis isn't going away. So the desire to have debt management tools, I think, is only growing. And the necessity of finding conservation opportunities and ways to protect nature to support all the kind of economic benefits, including addressing the climate crisis that we talked about, that's only increasing as well. So I think as the great video pointed out at the beginning, the people who are most profoundly affected, it's a theme of all the discussions we have here at COP, the people who are most profoundly affected by the climate crisis are the people who have the least sort of economic resilience and ability to support that. That's where we work as DFC across the board, and I know that's where we're looking for more of these kind of transactions.
Yeah, agreed. I think for just the Nature Conservancy's pipeline alone, we see about the opportunity, and this is just the next couple of years, at least $10 billion in potential debt that can be restructured to unlock $2 billion for money for conservation from the private sector. So that's a start, but we see huge opportunities beyond what TNC can do in the overall market where, if again we had more capacity within the DFC, and love that you are building capacity in this space to do more of these transactions. It's fantastic. And also other MDBs. There's, of course, a new task force that's launched on this subject. We can have more MDBs getting involved. That could scale up significantly, and we can start to crack the nut a bit on that $700 billion gap in financing that we have on an annual basis for biodiversity.
Interesting side question, and then the floor will be open. You mentioned sort of the most vulnerable populations and making sure that they're taken care of. How much of a factor is this in the negotiations around a debt for nature swap? How do you ensure that proceeds go where they need to go to indigenous peoples? And
yeah, great question. That is absolutely central to all of these transactions. That's often why, as Scott mentioned, these take a long time, not only to negotiate with the national governments, but to do the on-the-ground consultations, discussions with all the communities that are both positively and potentially could be negatively impacted by increased conservation. So this is a long process of how we do conservation as TNC, and many of the NGOs maybe in this room and out in the community at large it's people-focused, people-centered conservation. Without that, if you just create lines on a map and parks and guards, you're never going to really protect nature long-term. That has very limited impact. We've seen this time and time and again. People have to be engaged. So that's a critical part of the process.
Yeah, and these transactions take time because of that kind of local consultation amongst the other issues that we've discussed. These are not easy to explain transactions. If you look at the diagram for each one of these deals, there are a lot of boxes, many arrows, and it's extremely confusing. It's also a little scary because it's issuing new debt, and countries that are facing a debt crisis, that's politically hard to explain unless you can really point to all the benefits. So it's making sure communities aren't excluded, making sure that there's compensation mechanisms created, but also finding a way politically to explain these transactions that's acceptable, that's really important.
Can I mention one more thing? And this has been a critique of this instrument, and that is high transaction costs. And I just want to say that anything that's new has high transaction costs. And as we do more and more and more of these, we're going to see a reduction of those costs. And at the end of the day, to get the private sector involved in this, we have to ensure that the banks will, in fact, have an economic incentive to do these deals. So I think we have to kind of push back against the narrative that this is high transaction costs. All of this money is going into conservation at the end of the day. The vast majority of the proceeds from the swaps are going into conservation. So whenever you hear this sort of narrative, I think it's very important because we really want to make sure that these expand, not contract. And we have to make sure that we're listening and understanding that perspective, but at the same time recognizing to scale and to have private sector engagement, we have to do these things in a certain way, but ensure that as proceeds go to the ground.
Absolutely. Okay, audience questions, please. Front row.
Thank you for all that you're doing for climate. It's really important work. And you touched a little bit on mitigating harm to local communities. But I'm just more curious because 80% of biodiversity we know exists on indigenously stored lands, and traditional ecological knowledge is a proven way, a proven conservation solution, yet only 1% of climate finance goes to indigenous peoples. And I'm just curious if there's any push or any involvement directly with funding indigenous peoples in their conservation, aside from just mitigating harm. And if there's not, do you see a future where you do fund sovereign nations directly? Thank you.
So great question, and this is part of the whole consultation process. And so when we do what we call a marine spatial plan, that directly involves communities on the ground, the vast majority of which are indigenous or local communities that have been there for centuries. So it's critical that we understand the needs of the cultural needs, the physical needs, the ecological needs of indigenous people. And when we're doing these consultation processes, that's taken into consideration. And again, these are relatively new transactions, but through the trust fund mechanism that I mentioned, money is going directly to the ground to support the efforts of local fishermen, to support local marine protection, not just, we often think of marine protection as Coast Guard and big boats. It's often happening at a community level, and those are often indigenous people who need to put fuel in their boats to actually do the patrols themselves. That's often the biggest problem, is they won't even have enough gas in the tank to go and try to stop an illegal or unreported fishing that's happening in their marine reserve. So that is a critical part of the process, and ensuring that local people have direct access to this funding is really, really key.
Great question. Next. Please.
Yes, hi, Robin McGuckin with World Resources Institute. Jennifer, would love to take you up on your offer. I run a small impact investing group within WRI. We invest in early stage, non-returnable grants in early stage businesses. I know you said many of the deals are confidential, but I was wondering if you could just provide sort of a high-level overview of how you would see this functioning in practice, and particularly getting to that question of the impact on the ground. How does that implementation on the ground happen?
Well, when you say a high-level view of how they function, I'm assuming you mean maybe talk about some examples of the transactions that have already
Criteria
happened.
you might use.
Yeah. So if you take the transactions we've done already as a template for that, if you think about the one in the marine conservation area of the Galapagos, the criteria there is a debt problem. If a country doesn't have debt, there isn't the opportunity to deal with this. So a country that is interested in managing its debt, that was certainly the case in Ecuador. You need to also have nature that is vulnerable to threat and needs to be preserved. So Ecuador had just recently expanded the marine protection area around the Galapagos, had focused on illegal and unreported fishing, and needed funding to help support the enforcement of that. So that's where the two things came together to present the opportunity. You also had a willing government that was interested in working with the partners and making commitments and pushing forward the transaction. And we had the nonprofit organizations that could create the trust fund and administer it, which is incredibly important. TNC, by far in this area, has the most experience in doing that, but as we've mentioned, it's great to have more people involved in that as well. And finally, you need to have the capital markets opening in order to fund the exchange for the new debt. And we were able to achieve that actually after some delays, because there were some issues in the global markets that caused that to be necessary to push back a little bit. So all those things come together to create the kind of criteria where you're balancing off the individual benefits and the work that's necessary to get the transactions done.
Further questions? Yeah, please go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. Mariam Khosrowshahi from Deutsche Bank. So one of my clients has asked me two questions. One is that they said, as you sort of look at the conservation initiative, does it have to just be one, or can it include 2, 3 different initiatives? Say there's nature there, then biodiversity, and then maybe another third initiative. Can they include a couple of these KPIs? And the second question they had is, these transactions are long dated generally, and at times governments' priorities change in that time frame. Can they have flexibility?
So great question. I'll take the first one first, and maybe you want to take the second one. Okay. We'll both take both. So the answer is, depends on how much money is available for the transaction, right? So you don't want to spread the money out too thinly and try to do everything with, whether it's maybe $100 million over 20 years, you got to really pick what is the most important thing to be investing in. But yes, technically you can, of course, and that's what we've done in our transaction. It's not just nature, it's biodiversity within nature, and that's part of the marine spatial planning, is to understand where the highest biodiversity areas are so you can make sure those are protected, but also to look at climate resiliency in coastal communities and ensuring that coastal communities can, whether it's using nature-based solutions like growing mangroves and protecting coral reefs, that's all part of the process. So it really depends on how much money you have and what you want to do with it. So we'd like to encourage being focused and not trying to do too much, but certainly 30% protection by 2030 alone is really important. The second question, once you kind of set the rules of the road, it's important to sort of stick with it to some extent. Now, is there some flexibility in if you want to change some of the things that the proceeds go to as things change, sea level rises, storms increasing? My understanding, and I'm looking at my technical people here, is that yes, it is possible to tweak here and there, but ideally you've decided on something up front that is going to be meaningful, so you don't have to have a mid-course correction that's so material that it changes the whole deal.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. But the one thing I would add on the first question is we're exploring the possibility of some of these transactions for other outcomes. So if they are in countries that don't have nature that is in danger or in need of preservation, or that's not the interest of the government, but there's still development outcomes that we're interested in. Debt for women's economic empowerment, or water, or health outcomes. These are, as I mentioned before, sort of like giant impact bonds. And how exactly that would be structured to measure and enforce the outcomes, that's where I think the real art is. But this is, as long as there continues to be a debt crisis, this is an opportunity, I think, across the board for development outcomes.
Does seem like it's going to be with us for some time. I think the World Bank and IMF have forecasted that something like 75 countries are at risk of debt default just over the next couple of years. So it's really striking. Further audience questions? I think this will be our last one.
Good evening. Andrea Thanos from the African Wildlife Foundation. I have a question about the trust fund mechanism and whether there's a possibility within the structures to channel the resources through existing trust funds or existing financing mechanisms rather than sort of create a bespoke mechanism for the debt spot.
My understanding is yes, that there is possibility to do that. We need to look, of course, every single transaction requires deep due diligence to understand if the CTF, the Conservation Trust Fund, has the right mechanisms in place. But there's been a whole movement, of which been involved with since probably the 2000s, around strengthening conservation trust funds around the world. And there are a lot of great ones. So if a great one exists where the government is participating but doesn't have a majority, is one of many governance factors in a CTF, then absolutely we could use an existing trust fund.
Well, you've been a fantastic audience. I'm not seeing any further hands up. So one thing I could do is end with an invitation, actually, to you and open to anyone, really. You've made me think a lot about what you were saying about we need more take-up. We need more of the development finance community to be aware, educated, involved. So I'm proposing that we meet during the spring meetings in Washington, D.C., when all of these folks are going to be in town. We, the IIF, are based there. Co-host an event that brings together private sector, MDBs, yourselves as sort of leaders, to kind of help connect these dots. Anybody who's going to be in D.C. for the spring meetings is very welcome. So,
well, that's a deal.
Yeah?
Yeah, I think we're all in D.C., so easy.
Done. All right. Thank you so much. This has been a fantastic conversation. You're a wonderful audience.
Good job, moderator.
Good job, Sonny.